Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Jean, I'm an ancient historian, and today we're going to be talking about everything you got wrong about ancient Greek history. Well, not everything. And also I don't want to presume you might not personally have got this wrong, but these are some of the biggest misconceptions that I have come across online and in person as an ancient historian surrounding ancient Greek history and ancient Greek civilization. We're not going to dive deep into misconceptions around ancient Greek myths today because I'm pretty sure that could be its whole own separate video, and instead we're going to be looking at the reality of ancient Greek civilization, society and the lives of ancient Greeks themselves. So, what have you been getting wrong about ancient Greece? Well, number one, the big one, is that ancient Greece never existed. No, I'm not trying to be that woman on TikTok who claimed that Rome never existed. The civilizations that made up ancient Greece and the city-states that made up ancient Greece existed. They were real, the history is real. But ancient Greece as a concept or a country was not a thing. So I think it's easy to assume that because we have modern day Greece, ancient Greece was simply where modern day Greece is, and it was one individual, unique, separate and unified country, which it was not. What we refer to when we talk about ancient Greek history or ancient Greek civilizations is a collection of separate and separately governed city-states which had a lot in common but also had a lot of differences, and that's really important when talking about ancient Greece because it's really easy to go, the ancient Greeks believed this, or ancient Greece was like this, when actually there's a massive variation between city-states. Now, what did ancient Greek city-states have in common? For one, they all shared a language. That is the biggest similarity, or one of the two biggest similarities I would say, between all of the city-states that we consider ancient Greece today. And secondly, they share a religion. They worship the same gods. Now within that there still can be local variation. Different gods are more important to different city-states. Ares as the god of war was particularly important to Sparta, and outside of Sparta, even those city-states who, you know, went to war as they all did, were more interested in, say, Athena as the more logical strategic side of war. And because of that, Ares is actually one of the gods you find the fewest temples to across ancient Greece. Whereas in Athens, their patron goddess was Athena, that is their namesake, and in Olympia their patron god was Zeus. That's not to say that they did not worship the whole pantheon of ancient Greek gods and goddesses. Hestia was still important in the home, Hera was still important to marriage, Artemis was still important to young girls, Apollo was still important to musicians, but there was certain emphasis placed on different gods, and you could also find local variation in myth. So one of the most significant ones there is that, for example, a lot of the impressive feats attributed to Heracles in other Greek city-states were attributed to Theseus in Athens, because Theseus was an Athenian hero, he was the king of Athens, and therefore you will find in certain variations or on pottery the same feats being undertaken by Heracles and Theseus depending on where those sources are from. So yes, they did worship the same gods, but there was local variation and they spoke the same language, although again, of course, local variation in the same way that you get dialect today. But outside of that, the citizens of these city-states saw their identity as inherently tied up in their individual city-state. Yes, they were Hellenic, which was the word used to refer to those who shared the Greek language and the Greek religion, but they were also Athenian or Lacedaemonian or Theban, whichever city-state they originated from, and that was really what was most important in terms of their identity, or at least in the creation of their identity by that individual state. And because of that, you can find plenty of evidence of the individual Greek city-states in conflict. They do not always agree, and they even end up at war with one another, for example during the Peloponnesian War, which was headed up by the Lacedaemonians or the Peloponnesians on one side, aka what we refer to now as Sparta, and the Athenians on the other side, who lost. And we had different Greek city-states taking different sides. We also see ancient Greek city-states overrunning other ancient Greek city-states and enslaving their populations, killing their men and taking their women and children. And often one of the rhetorical reasons behind these conflicts was the difference in political systems, because there were a large variety of different ruling bodies throughout Greece and different political system. In Athens, we have a democracy, or an ancient Athenian version of democracy, one of the original democracies. We also see various forms of oligarchies throughout the ancient Greek city-states. So they govern themselves differently, they identify themselves differently, and that is why ancient Greece was never a thing. Now that's not, again, to underestimate the similarities, and you can also see in ancient Greek sources references to those similarities and a sense of shared identity that goes beyond the individual city-states. You can see rhetoricians, for example, call to a shared sense of Hellenic identity in opposition to, say, barbarian outsiders like the Persians, according to the Greeks, because the term barbarian was not originally used to refer to perhaps your Hellenic neighbour. It specifically referred to those who do not speak Greek. It effectively means talking nonsense. It is onomatopoeic and refers to the bar noise that the ancient Greeks referred to barbarians as speaking, based on their own prejudices and sense of superiority. So there was shared identity, there was also separate identity, and because of that it's really important to understand the nuances and differences between all of the city-states, but also what unites them. Now, number 2 is one that you may have come across before, but I still meet people who don't know this about ancient Greek civilization, and I think it's a really fun fact, and that is that the ancient Greek statues that we think of as pearly white and marble do not represent the realities of ancient Greek art, because in fact these statues in their original form would have been heavily painted. They would have been coated in brightly coloured paints, and on top of this they would have littered the streets and temples and buildings of the different ancient Greek city-states. These statues were everywhere in bright colours, bold patterns, and they would have been incredibly eye-catching because of this. Whereas now the paint has eroded, and most of the stone and bronze statues that survive from ancient Greece that we can observe now, perhaps in museums or online, look to be one colour overall. And there's a few reasons that this myth arose. Originally, we obviously found the statues in this state and it was much more difficult to tell they'd ever been painted. But as scientific techniques have developed, like the use of infrared, archaeologists and historians have been able to identify colours or remnants of paint on these statues and recreate what they would have looked like visually in ancient Greece. Yet still the idea of the white marble statue of classical antiquity persists, and a lot of that is really rooted in racism and classism, and there's some fantastic literature and books that you can read on this, but it's to do with the association of the white marble statue and a white Western wealthy elite. So that is something that is really, really interesting to read more into. But for now, make sure next time you're looking at an ancient Greek statue to think about what it might have looked like in ancient Greece rather than what it looks like now. And top misconception about ancient Greece, number 3, and the final for this installment of these videos anyway, is that the ancient Greeks invented togas, or that the ancient Greeks even wore togas. Togas are something really, really interesting because they've become very much just blanketly associated with classical antiquity in all civilizations, including the Greeks and the Romans, whereas they were very much a Roman dress. The Romans invented togas, the Romans wore togas, and yes, there was likely togas introduced into Greece when the Romans went beyond Italy and started expanding into the rest of the Mediterranean, but they did not originate there and they were not widely worn before Roman dominance. Now, don't get me wrong, I have actively participated in this misconception. I was a member of my university's classic society, I went to toga pub crawls, I pretended I was an ancient Greek, but I was wrong, and here's why. The ancient Greeks actually more commonly wore a chiton, which is a type of tunic. That was the most common garb throughout ancient Greece, and of course, like I mentioned before, there's variations according to city-state. But for example, in Athens, the chiton would have been worn as a ankle-length, floor-length piece of clothing by women, whereas it would have been much shorter, knee-length or even shorter than that among men, because women were expected to cover a lot more of their body. And this carries on into a lot of other aspects of Athenian clothing, including the veil. And something I'm aware not a lot of people know about ancient Athens in particular is that most commonly women were expected to veil themselves when walking around in public. And there's a fantastic book on that topic called Aphrodite's Tortoise by Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, which I would highly recommend checking out. But there was a deep-rooted sense of conservatism around the way women dressed in Athens, and it was very strictly and tightly controlled. In the Hellenistic era, you even see a semi-police force arise in order to control and monitor what women were wearing on the streets. Returning to the toga, however, probably the closest ancient Greek garment to the toga is the himation, which is a cloth garment which would have been worn over one shoulder, draped in a similar way to the toga, not exactly the same. Once you get into the nitty-gritty of ancient clothing and the way it was pinned and draped, it's all very complicated and different and unique. But in terms of appearance, you could certainly mistake a himation for a toga in, say, a sculpture if you're not familiar with ancient Greek garb. You'll also see the peplos commonly worn by women in ancient Greek statuary and paintings, which again is a floor-length garment made out of draping fabric that covers most of the body. So those are my top 3 misconceptions about ancient Greek history, at least in my experience. So to recap, ancient Greece was not one country. The ancient Greek statues were heavily painted in bright colours and patterns, and the ancient toga was a Roman garb, not an ancient Greek garb. So let me know if any of this was new information to you, and I'd also love to hear from you if there are any popular misconceptions surrounding ancient history that you find fascinating and would love more people to know the correct answer to, shall we say. If you would like a second video in this series specifically about mythology, then I would also love to know, and until next time, happy learning, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everybody. Oh, and just a quick PS, if you're looking for further literature to read on any of these topics, since this has been quite a fun, snappy intro to these issues, I will link them in the description box down below. So happy reading.